And we're rolling. Welcome everybody. This is the bi-weekly SIG VMware meeting. Today is June the 21st, 2018, and we're gonna start with our community updates from Steve. You can take it off, Steve.
Okay, just a minute. Okay, hopefully you can see the shared agenda meeting notes.
Looks good.
We'll start with community updates. First of all, the charter. Every SIG is expected to have a charter, and there's a model template for that that was created by SIG Architecture. This was a somewhat recent rule, so when this SIG got off the ground, we didn't have one. I've got a PR submitted to put in place a charter. The process that's required by the community is that this get reviewed by the SIG membership. So I put a link to this charter in the notes. If you can do that and go take a look at it, add whatever comments you feel appropriate. If you like it, maybe it looks good to me. If you don't, you can suggest what you don't like or what needs to be added. I don't think we need to spend time actually looking that in here. It's pretty much modeled on some of the other SIGs that have charters in place, and in terms of the scope of what's subject matter for the SIG and not, it's the kinds of things that we put in place in the documents and in the notes coming from the first meeting in this group. So I don't think much of that is likely to be controversial, but take a look. Second item under community updates, I have observed the operation of other SIGs, in particular the SIG storage, for a number of years. And one of the things that they use to track things is a spreadsheet. I have a link to this. Let me open it. And I'm proposing that for this SIG that we might be well served by using some of this to organize activities. You can go look at our SIG VMware tag in GitHub, but not every undertaking aligned with using Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure is going to be tracked by issues in the Kubernetes repo. Some of them might spread to other repos, to documentation. Some of them might even be issues related to getting tasks done, like onboarding training videos or things like this. So I think that a broader forum for listing these with current statuses, the identity of the people involved, might be useful. I put together a draft here. This was really just I cut and pasted what they use over in the storage SIG, and I seeded this with a few suggested line items in rows, just to give you an idea of what this is about. You can put issues there, and then along with the issues, you can use it to track the target status for the next Kubernetes release. You can see that it has an actual link to the GitHub repo if there is something associated with this line item in that repo. And over in the storage SIG, they typically color code these as you near end release with red, yellow, green as a quick overview dashboard of status. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out there for thoughts and opinions if anybody's got any.
Hey Steve, how consistent is the usage of that type of a spreadsheet across other SIGs?
Well, you know, some of them, like SIG Architecture, don't seem to have anything remotely like that, but then they're not aligning activities with a release. So I think in particular, once we get involved with trying to bring home the cloud provider, this thing would be more useful. we've gotten along for whatever number of weeks without it so far, but I think that it's useful for tracking things we want to get done. The short answer, though, is it's not universal at all. Some SIGs might use it, some don't. And I have to admit that even though I've been involved with some SIGs, it's by no means all of them or even half of them. There's so many now that, except for the community people like Josh Burkus and Paris, I doubt that anybody dabbles in all of them to really give a statistically valid sample here.
Aside from looking horizontally at the other SIGs, I'd throw out there that this actually very, very closely follows what SIG release does for the release, and the features lead for SIG release has a spreadsheet that's almost identical to this, so this would allow you to feed up very nicely and concisely into that process, which would be greatly appreciated.
I think this would help guide us too. Even the SIG leadership is expected to give periodic updates in various forums like the community meeting and then contributor summits. So it's useful to have this in one place so that you don't have to go gather it all up.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea for, especially since we're expected to give back, status updates, and this, it's a nice dashboard that everybody can look at and understand where we're at. I think right now what we're missing is a sponsor inside the SIG, somebody who can list, carry forward the effort initially, at least to keep this list valid and in sync with the real status. Are you?
I think that rather than have it be autocratic, on SIG storage, the membership can edit that list, and the particular individuals assigned to a light item are the ones best equipped to do status updates on it. I'd suggest that perhaps we could just try that, and if it works, it works. And if we turn out to have problems with that, I don't know why we would, but if we did, we could reevaluate the process.
Yeah, I was trying to more like get somebody to jumpstart the effort, like, making sure that at least we have, the spreadsheet reflects what we're working on right now, and then assign to people that are working on the specific line items to provide status updates and continue, nurturing the spreadsheet with new information.
I actually, when I put those lines in there, my first pass was to go at the GitHub repo looking for SIG VMware tags and just making a few of them. But there were actually so many that would have taken a good deal of time. But I think at a minimum, if we have open issues in GitHub in whatever repo that this is associated with Kubernetes, and when we go out of Kubernetes will of course bleed over into a new one. We've got the community repo with things potentially going on in there.
Steve, maybe let's start with step one here. So does anybody on the call disagree with using this spreadsheet to track items?
Sounds like no.
Sounds like no. So I think that's one. Like it looks like if you guys want to use this to track, then that's what the SIG agrees with. And then the next thing is how to get it filled with information, how to make it accurate. And I don't know if we want to ask today to do that, or just to say, hey, let's defer this until next meeting so that everybody can bring their ideas, and then we can work on this as an active item for next meeting. Maybe that's
the other thing is it's already shared with the SIG membership. So I'd actually invite people to go start populating it. Do you see any issue with doing that now, Clint? Or do you want even a discussion of whether the columns are appropriate and things?
No, I think the first thing was let's agree that we're going to use it. I think that's done. And now the action is like possibly for next meeting that we review what's in it, what people actually added to it.
All right. And then I think I'd invite it to go beyond GitHub issues. So there's a few things I added in there that came about because I've been somewhat monitoring things tagged for VMware in the Kubernetes Slack. And when users ask for questions or report that they're having issues or problems with documentation, they're not always creating GitHub issues. So a few of those line items I put there are of that nature where they don't have a current GitHub issue. We've also got some requests that are coming through other channels on the Kubernetes project, like the meeting just this week coming from the cloud provider, SIG, had a suggestion that as a bare minimum, each cloud provider needs to compose some new documentation, one of them being a getting started document, the other a settings and configuration document. And nobody disagreed with that. It just seems like the right thing to do. But there aren't outstanding issues to do that right now. But it would be nice to get them on the list so that we can solicit some volunteers to start doing that work. Okay, so let's table this for now in this meeting, but the message here is that we're going to go forward with the idea of utilizing a tracking spreadsheet, and that members in the community who are engaged on activities now or who want to propose those should go to that spreadsheet and make entries. Moving on, I just got this notice this morning that the Kubernetes project is changing the process for conducting Zoom meetings. I don't think we need to go into it in detail, but apparently there have been some issues of violations of the code of conduct. They are changing the Zoom links. I believe that this is an attempt to not make them publicly available, but expose them only to actual members. They're asking that these Zoom meetings be conducted with dual hosts so that the one who's not talking can operate the kill switch, and adding a third role of having a note taker, which I think in this group will ask for volunteers on. The host is instructed to start with screen sharing disabled, and the advisory also says that if a violation of code of conduct occurs, the meeting is supposed to be shut down and moved to the Slack channel. So I'll leave it at that. Beyond what I put here, I don't know yet, and this just came out this morning, as far as I'm aware. But if you've put away this Zoom link, by the time the next meeting rolls around, it could be that it's invalid. So be on the lookout for that is all I've got to say. Okay, that's it for my community things. I think I'll turn it back to you, Fabio, for an active project discussion.
Yep. We have a couple of things to discuss today. So first one is the update on Cloud Provider vSphere. So you might have heard that SIG Cloud Provider was formed a couple of weeks ago. Full meetings for the older working group, for the Cloud Provider working group, were stopped, and they resumed yesterday as SIG Cloud Provider, given that the working group has been promoted to full-blown SIG. We resumed working. There's obviously a lot of excitement around, starting working on the Cloud Provider audit tree. There was some updates on the call regarding the involvement of the Start SIG with the move audit tree. So as many of you might know that the current cloud provider Intree are dealing not just with or reaching out to compute nodes to figure out the IP address and so on, but also the entire storage allocation is pretty much done through the cloud provider Intree right now. And Storage SIG is involved in trying to make a plan and produce a roadmap to move these components out of tree. Apparently, the roadmap they're looking at for the completion of this work is about 12 months. So we're talking about a year from now. Obviously, the objective is to have it done before that date, but there are some concerns around this being a longer time than it was anticipated before. So if you're interested in this discussion, please join the SIG Cloud Provider meeting. It is now bi-weekly. It's no longer a weekly meeting. It's still on Wednesday. I don't have the time right now on top of my head. Actually, I can look it up, given that we also moved our own sync up. So it's on Wednesday. It's bi-weekly on Wednesday, and it's 1 p.m. Pacific. We also moved our own cloud provider vSphere sync up to align with this new time of SIG Cloud Provider. The new Cloud Provider vSphere sync up is now at 2 p.m. Pacific. We had our first one yesterday. There's a recording available of all the sessions. It's actually available on a Kubernetes community GitHub repo. There's a link that points to the YouTube playlist. And so it's now bi-weekly again. It aligns with SIG Cloud Provider, 2 p.m. on Wednesday. It's half an hour long. If you're interested in vSphere as a platform to run Kubernetes on, please join those meetings. And that's it for the Cloud Provider vSphere. I wanted to resume a conversation we started at the last SIG VMware meeting on possibly creating a working group for CI on vSphere, more like a generic on-prem CI facility for Kubernetes. And Andrew, I see you're here, so I wanted to ask you if you thought about this.
Yeah, thank you, Fabio. Yeah, I've given it a lot of thought, and we've been busy ourselves finishing up some other work. Just a brief mention, we did submit a pull request to the cross-cloud team that will make vSphere show up as one of the platforms on which Kubernetes and other cloud-native application performance tests are run at cncf.ci. So that PR is waiting for review, so good news there. This focuses more directly on the actual Kubernetes test infrastructure, the working group. In our internal planning repo, I've created probably half dozen issues focused on this effort, including one about the scope and details we need to get right for creating a working group around this. And I think the current thinking, and I think this was the result of last meeting, if I remembering correctly, someone can correct me, was that we wanted to at least get something in place to satisfy VMware's needs with respect to Kubernetes, Kubernetes testing for things like Minikube or the cloud provider. And then phase 2 would be to create a working group to basically establish the same type of platform, and phase 3 would be implementing that platform, where phase 3 could completely abandon what phase 1 created. We're not trying to create something in phase 1 that we're going to say this is the way we have to do it, but rather we need to be able to satisfy our own testing needs, and then learn from that, present that to the working group, or say and maybe they say we should start from scratch, and that's fine. And so that's sort of where we are now. I've been finishing up some other things related to testing, and I haven't actually moved towards the creation of one with other people. Well, that's not true. I've got a meeting scheduled with the cross-cloud people about their relationship with testing in Kubernetes to sort of get their use cases. And maybe I'll reschedule that, and that could be something they present to this working group once it's established. So I will actually defer to Fabio and Clint here, or Tim, or even Steve. My concern about having a working group in tandem to this other effort, which is the some testing of the things I've already mentioned, is that it looks bad. We're doing our own thing while we're participating in the working group, which the goal of is to also do this thing. So that's why I haven't pushed harder on it.
I'm not sure what you mean it looks bad. You mean like a working group that's just us? Because at the last cloud provider meeting,
that's not what I mean, Steve.
Okay. Well, tell me what you mean.
I mean, a working group that could include people from different organizations like Red Hat or Google or Microsoft. I don't, whoever is interested. But the goal would be to create something on top of vSphere that could satisfy test requirements for members of all of those organizations. However, because we have immediate needs, we're also working on something that will satisfy those needs for us. I don't necessarily want to, I don't know how it looks to be involved in a working group that creates a solution that solves those needs for us while we're also working on something more quickly in turn. Does that make sense? I don't think I'm outlining it.
Andrew, I think that SIG VMware has testing needs. If you look at all the features that we're talking about developing, whether it's the out-of-tree cloud provider or new features we're looking at delivering, ideally these would all include a CI/CD portion where we're actually actively testing as we do these pull requests. And I think that's the immediate need that the SIG VMware group has. And then past that, I think that we've got an opportunity to work with other SIGs and others who may think that they can take advantage of the vSphere platform to expand their test coverage. And I think that we're more than willing to have those conversations. But I think
So would you suggest creating a working group for just members of SIG VMware at first, and then expanding that, or creating a second working group or expanding the first one once we satisfy the SIG's needs?
Well, I'll tell you something that came up in the cloud providing working group, whether we attempt to do that or not. The discussion that went on there is that as a mandatory part of doing a cloud provider, you're going to be obligated to come up with a test suite. Now, that tests it on your cloud provider. So even though this VMware infrastructure would have utility for testing some platforms, I don't think it's of any great use to AWS or GCP.
No, we're heavily aligned.
They do want to discuss what these.
That's not correct.
Yeah, we're heavily aligned with other platforms that are on-prem. I've had discussions with folks at Red Hat, especially that are interested. So yeah,
I just want to get back to the question, the root of the question. I don't want to get too off topic here. Am I hearing that it would make sense to create a working group for people participating in this SIG and other VMware related technologies, and then expand that working group or create a second working group once we satisfied our own needs to address other organizations that may be able to leverage our same infrastructure?
Well, I think that if we don't create a working group to address the common test cases of all cloud providers, somebody else is going to do it whether we want to initiate it or not. It'll happen either with us or without us. So it will happen. And do we want to just declare that this working group we're getting involved with is the one, or do we want to have two breakout?
Well, again, that goes back to my original question, Steve. We are going to, if we declare a working group to be the one for all cloud providers, we possibly and most realistically will hamper progress for that for testing our cloud provider, where we could do it much more rapidly if we didn't involve everybody at first. So that's why I raised that question with which to begin. I simply expanded the scope to be more than just internal, but to all members of SIG VMware.
Let me give a slightly different perspective on this. So the point here is that we have to provide a CI facility for cloud provider, vSphere, obviously, and potentially two other things, right? So a working group has, things they're working on. So a working group is established, and it starts working on something. And I will say that if we decide to create this working group, the first thing that the working group will start to work on is establish a CI system that works with Tide. And I will say that the first project to consume the CI will be cloud provider vSphere. Once that goal is established, then there is a lot more things out there, like a SIG storage for CSI plugins.
Yeah, exactly. I'm fine with what you're describing. Mm-hmm. I'm fine with what you're describing. What I am hesitant to do is from the jump say this is the working group to develop a CI system for all cloud providers. That I think is over. I think is over
Yeah. Well, if you don't say that, somebody else is going to create.
That's fine. Somebody else
that
can.
does say
I
it,
don't. Somebody
and
else
you'll
can.
probably have to go to the meeting. So if you have to go to those meetings plus another one, is it really going to speed up your effort by having this one targeted at vSphere infrastructure?
I don't have to go to the other meeting. I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Hold on a
We
second,
need to satisfy our own.
Hold on a sec.
Hey, guys, hold on. Does anybody else on the call have any comments about this? It sounds like we've got one opinion, which is, hey, in the short term, let's satisfy CSI or the vSphere SIG's concerns of the cloud provider, and then we can tackle the broader question after that. And the other opinion is to tackle the broad question and then also tackle us at the same time. Anybody else have any comments or concerns about either approach?
I'd like to hear the test infra's SIG's thoughts on it.
I was actually in that SIG meeting this week, Tim, and I'm having a second call. There's a meeting. Go look at their meeting notes from this week, and Cole added a line that Stephen thought I added, so I think he assumed I had a giant pair on me to go put this in his notes. It said on-ramping VMware to Tide. Cole had actually added it, and there's a meeting about using, Prow. There's a meeting at later today that I'm attending with a few people about standing up Prow instances internally for, you're running your own Prow instance to participate in the Tide system. So they're thinking, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but that was sort of the scope of the call this week, was people running their own Prow instances so that they can do that testing that they need to do, and then ultimately, right, the I think what's it, Crier or whatever it is, throws those results into the bucket that Crier then scrapes that Kubernetes throws up on the page. So, but yeah, I mean, I've been attending those meetings, and I think it's what 2 SIGs need to sponsor a working group. I mean, I would probably touch base with them or the cloud provider for testing for a working group for just the vSphere cloud provider.
So that makes sense to me. I mean, if SIG VMware sees a local need for something, but also has the breadth of awareness to realize that it in the long term isn't going to just be SIG VMware, to reach out to those 2 SIGs in particular as ones that are kind of spanning that area. I think that you'll find co-travelers there.
You said Cole?
Co-travelers in the problem space.
Oh, co-travelers. Sorry, yeah.
But
like-minded.
in the meantime, I mean that can take more time to get a ball rolling when it has a lot more stakeholders, right? So in the meantime, having recognized it makes sense to look at getting something done locally within the SIG.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if we're genuinely concerned about, I mean, I hear Steve's concern about somebody's going to form a broader working group. I mean, honestly, what I would likely end up doing was be working with Test Infra without forming a working group specific to VMware to get Prow up and running in our infrastructure to participate in Tide so that we could do testing of what the cloud provider with whatever, however we want to do it. And then this goes back to what I was originally saying, participate in the broader group. And then maybe we end up throwing that out with the bathwater, the initial implementation for something that the group designs.
Let me ask this question. So if we form a working group, which is, I think what you said, focused on vSphere, does that Prow integration, Tide integration, what if we decided that, a month into it, hey, the better approach is to be a part of this bigger thing and prioritize that? Is there any problem with just canceling the working group and saying, hey,
no, there's not. I mean, not as long as we are ultimately, if we're participating in Tide, right? If we're uploading results to a bucket, I mean, that is a very interesting test infrastructure they've created. But and I have many thoughts on it, but one of the things I like about it is how it's tight. I'll say tightly decoupled. The bucket doesn't care how the data gets there. It just has to be laid out in a particular way. It doesn't care what producer or how it gets there, and it just gets scraped.
And Andrew, I think my question was actually before that, like, what if we form a working group and we actually don't get any code done? and we just say, hey, we learned some stuff, we did some discovery, but we also learned along the way, maybe we should do this other thing. Like, is that okay?
I see no real issue with that. I just don't want them to necessarily overlap. If they're overlapping, then we should focus on one or the other.
Does anybody see a problem with like starting a working group and then canceling it if we decide that after discovery it's better to do something else?
I just have a question. Why a working group and not a sub-project?
Yeah, I actually think it should just be a project, Clint, because again, one of the main focuses, or one of the focuses of SIG testing this week was, let's get more people using Prowl. We really believe in it, and they're even thinking about how they start, for the lack of a better word, marketing it as a product that other people should use. And so I volunteered myself, and to some extent us, is like, hey, we're a great test candidate. We're actually investigating that right now. Please, tell us what we can do to help. So, yeah, there's that.
So what's the priority behind getting CI/CD up and running for vSphere? Like, what's the driving factor? What's the important thing that we're doing this for in the short term? Because we don't have it yet, but what's really pushing us to do it in the short term?
It's blocking that Minikube PR. It's when we want to. And we need to have better coverage of the cloud provider since it's going out of tree.
Is that the big thing though? Like the idea that we need to ensure a certain level of functionality that we have today, so that as Fabio's this cloud provider working group, as they develop their code, that we know that everything works during this transition. Like, is that the driving factor? Is to get CI/CD in place for functionality today, so we can start to abstract and pull these things apart successfully?
There's three things right now. First one is Minikube. Third, not in order of importance, obviously. First one is Minikube. Second one is, the new cloud provider vSphere work that has to be tested end-to-end on the vSphere platform. And third one is the actual entry provider, which is still part of Kubernetes Core, and is still going to be part of Kubernetes Core for at least some time, possibly more than a year, or even more. So, and we're currently not testing that at all. And you might remember that a change made by somebody from Azure while lifting some of the interfaces during the PR actually broke the cloud provider functionality, and we just realized that when we actually tested it in an environment manually, but it was actually broken during one of the releases. So I think it's very important to have something testing ASAP.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing then is the goal probably should be that aligned with the goal for the cloud provider. In other words, if we're going to declare the cloud provider is done, we're going to have this test fixture in place, because that will be the basis for our declaration that it's done.
I actually want to say I agree with Tim. The more I think about it, I think the next step, and today's call would be with Cole from SIG Testing would be a good place to bring this up, is to solicit their feedback and say and make it specific to the vSphere cloud provider. Don't make it broad at first, but make it specific and say, hey, look, here's our test case, and we think it could apply to others, and see if they have some ideas around it, because maybe them as a sponsor lends credence to us creating this broader working group with us as the initial guinea pig for implementing something and designing something along with SIG testing, because now all of a sudden we're a working group for all cloud providers. SIG testing is involved to create something with us, and we're the initial effort at proving that it works.
I think it sounds great, but my concern is that we're behind right now. Like, we don't have testing that we should have.
Okay, well, that makes it simple. Let's do something internally, and then I don't think we need a working group for the internal effort. If we want to have a broader one, do with a working group. But for just the vSphere cloud provider,
okay, let me
Okay.
see if we can get to a conclusion for this discussion. Let's do it this way. This is my proposal. Let's start by, let's say, incubating the test infra / prowl / tide effort for the vSphere CI project inside SIG VMware without creating a new working group. So part of this, possibly part of the cloud provider vSphere subproject, if we need a meeting to discuss that. And if eventually this becomes larger and it involves more SIGs, and it involves like SIG stores, for example, or things like that, then we decide if we want to create a working group and spin out a working group for that.
I mean, that's fine with me. I mean, I'm hearing two things, right? Clint's, we need it now. We're behind. I would even counter like what you have is possibly like more than we need. It's probably the minimum to fall in line with, with the community. But no, that's fine. But and then there's the broader effort, because I was jotting down a dozen use cases yesterday. If I'd be like how we present storage, how we could I found places on Google Groups saying, hey, we can't do Ceph on GCE and things like that. So yes, there are a dozen things we can satisfy, and those belong in that working group, and probably more than VMware's own working group. Probably all cloud providers.
Well, let me make
it's that initial effort that I don't want to hamper or hinder.
Whether we initiate a working group or not, if one should break out in the next quarter, which I think is like at least a 50% probability, we have to send representatives. We can't ignore it.
Okay,
So
we'll address that. Let's address that when the time comes. But in terms of Fabio's closing out of this conversation, does everybody agree that this is how we want to do it? We won't form a working group, but we will take it as a sub-project within SIG VMware?
I agree with the caveat. I want to have that conversation with SIG testing and see what their thoughts are on it too.
Okay.
And also, it's not a requirement that everything be a formal sub-project or working group. I mean,
That's what I was saying. Yeah.
Kind of start moving and see where this goes and where let it happen over 2 to 4 weeks organically. Try and pull in some other stakeholders, and the right answer will present itself.
Okay, and that's good feedback. So we have a list that we started in terms of features that we want to start to work with as the next step to put this on that list, the spreadsheet. I think that formalizes that we're going to work on it as a SIG. Is that right?
Yeah. Steve, do you want to add that? I'm jotting down.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, it is settled for now. All right, that was the last item for the active project update. Let's move on to the demo. We have Loke. Loke, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. All right. Loke is going to demo virtual kubelet with vSphere.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure how much people here knows about virtual kubelet, and so I threw together a presentation. I don't know if you guys say no or whether I
Go for it.
Okay. I also have here Stephen. He's the new manager of VIC in Beijing. Just invited him so that he could understand what this project is, since we built it on top of VIC. Okay.
Cool.
So let me share my screen here. Okay, I assume everybody can see it. So this is just a presentation on what the virtual kubelet project is, and let's go ahead and begin. So I want to start with a preface on, we introduced VIC at the end of 2016, and what it is a container as a service. Okay, an admin installs it and receives a service endpoint. It removes the need to deploy and maintain a node, and it provides a way to rapidly deploy a container service. And all the other cloud providers out there also have something very similar, like Azure ACI and AWS Fargate. Okay, so Kubernetes is difficult. The downside of Kubernetes is that it's extremely difficult to deploy and maintain for admins. And transitively, it's very difficult for them to scale out. It's extremely difficult to debug a infrastructure problem when they arise because of this difficulty. And from the sound of it, it's very similar to a set of problems that a container as a service solved for a much simpler case when you only have a single host. So there are a couple of solutions that we can do to solve this problem. We can invent a system that deploys and manages a Kubernetes cluster, e.g. PKS. We can create and offer a managed Kubernetes as a service in the cloud, like BKE or GKE. Or we can create a pod as a service offering like Vic did for containers. And none of these solutions are one size fit all, and each of them solves a different need. So let's talk about Virtual Kubelet. This was a project that was started by Brendan Burns at Microsoft, and the value proposition to customers is that it's nodeless. They don't have to deploy and maintain a node. In return, they get at least from the cloud providers, infinite resources for developers. HA and scale out is managed by the cloud providers. So that removes that headache from admins. The value proposition for Microsoft was that it provided faster monetization, less time for admins deploying and maintaining a node, and more time deploying applications. It also provides improved utilization for the cloud providers, right? So the cloud provider can manage a set of pools of resources, and all the customers can utilize the same set of pool. Microsoft will handle, or AWS will handle multi-tenancy in this case. So there's less idle resources while customers, admins are deploying nodes. Less idle resources if a customer's cluster is not fully utilized. And it's better management of CapEx for Microsoft and Amazon when customers come and go. So why Virtual Kubelet? It provides all the benefit of a pod as a service, similar to the VIX proposition for containers. It provides an unopinionated architecture for how a pod as a service is implemented. For instance, in Vic, we implemented with pod VMs in a VCH. For Azure, they implemented with a managed Kubernetes cluster behind the pod as a service endpoint. By the way, I will have some diagrams later, so just bear with me. So an existing kubelet assumes a Linux host, and often with privileged access. For instance, it assumes a local Linux file system. It assumes the possibility of a privileged access to the host system, for instance, cap sysadmin. It assumes the possibility of a Unix socket. It assumes access to IP tables. And it assumes that it can put its finger onto the Docker container file system on the host. I understand why all these assumptions were made initially. It's the quickest and easiest path to just building out the orchestrator. But now moving forward, it's less ideal for a pod as a service model. So this is the current status of the virtual kubelet. Here are the companies that are involved. We're one of them. And there is a campaign for a nodeless working group, and it's currently stuck in debate over verbiage of the charter. The working group will not presuppose virtual kubelet is the final solution. And there are other alternatives, and I have figured out an alternative to doing this in the scheduler for the compute. But when it comes to network and storage, the same problem exists as it does with virtual kubelet. And when I talked to George Hicken on Vic about this, he concluded the same thing. It sounds like a virtual kubelet to me. And I don't disagree. It's just a different name. we could say that we're solving it through the scheduler instead of through a virtual node. Okay.
Look, I have one piece of feedback about that. I think it's in line with something that Steve sent to some of us.
Andrew, sorry to cut you off, but we have 10 minutes left, and
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll do it after the call. Then.
Okay, so let me try to speed this up myself. The virtual kubelet has a common set of problems across several working groups and several proposals, including the sandbox pod and the multi-tenancy working group. Speaking of sandbox pods, when VMware introduced VIC, we isolated containers in VM. Strong isolation, stronger security, and piggybacking on the virtual kubelet work, we created the concept of a pod VM, and this fits very nicely with the sandbox pod proposal that Google is proposing. And I will have a diagram of what that is. So what's left to be done? We got to design a nodeless model for networking, for storage, design the certificate handling. We're going to move the in-tree provider to a library model. This is a lot simpler than an out-of-tree model, and it will allow each vendor to have their own repo. And it doesn't prevent us to later on move to an out-of-tree model. We got to finish the rest of the virtual kubelet and providers and then formulate a conformance plan. Okay, so next thing I want to show, before I show the demo, is, I will show the web page for what our solution is. So I maybe mistakenly assumed that everybody knows what a VCH is and how the VIC model works, and I should have done a diagram of that. But this is a shorthand of what the VIC model is. So we have an appliance VM. Today we have a Docker Persona server that's Docker API compliant. We have a port layer that does all of the provisioning for us. And then when a user does a Docker request, it comes in and a container VM is created. In this new model, we add in the virtual kubelet, which acts as another persona server. And it joins a Kubernetes cluster. And when we pull a pod spec that's scheduled for us, we then create a pod VM that contains multiple containers. So if you guys understand how pods are actually implemented, it's just a bunch of container with a top-level pause container that acts as a parent of all the containers. In our case, we just create the isolation unit of a pod VM and have all the containers running inside. And when we did the VIC container VM, we don't have Docker or any other runtime running under there. We unpack the container file system onto the VM and run the processes natively. With the pod VM, we're now running each of the container. We want it to be as much OCI compliant as possible. So we have switched over to using runc as the runtime of each container. And so that's the diagrams. Let me go ahead. What I want to show today is a demo of VIC that we did a couple months ago using the virtual kubelet, showing this pod VM concept. Okay. Okay, here we go. Let me maximize this. Okay. Let me just skip. Can you guys see that? It's a little dark. I think it's only showing from one window, actually.
I see a couple command prompt windows, and
Okay.
As you scroll around, you kind of cut off the beginning of the top one.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Is that better?
Yeah, I can see the one. If you're intending to show both of those split windows,
It
no.
might be just delayed. On our screen here, we see both windows, the top and bottom. Do you not see the top and bottom?
We see top and bottom, but the top one is empty.
Okay, it's empty for now. Okay, so let me just talk through this. So right now, I currently have a Kubernetes cluster running, and I am deploying Vic to get a container as a service and a pod as a service endpoint. So this is just deploying Vic right now. It's going to go. So at the top here, I showed the YAML file that I'm running. It has two containers. One is a container that does nothing but sleep, and the other one does nothing. And I am currently using node selector as a way to get my pod running on the virtual kubelet in our VCH. Okay. Fast forward. Now I understand that there is a way to fast forward this without jumping around on the progress bar. I'm not sure how to do that. Okay. So now we have a VCH deploy. We have a Docker endpoint, and and we're just going to look at what containers are currently running. The first thing I show is when you do kubectl get nodes, you see the kubelet Vic Docker. That's the name of my VCH. It has joined the cluster. And here I show the pod that I will run again. And the first thing I do is I provide a label for the virtual kubelet so that when I deploy this pod, the pod gets scheduled to me. Okay. So here I did a Docker PS on the VCH. Now remember that both the Docker persona and the virtual kubelet are sharing the same VCH. So just like with regular Kubernetes, you can go onto a Kubernetes node and use Docker and see all the containers that it's launching. And the first thing that we see here is what you see here when I do ps-a is you see what is in essence a kube proxy. It doesn't run because of certificates and also because it wants access to the IP tables. And so it exited. So I'll go ahead and start it. But it doesn't matter. We don't have service support yet. Okay, so when I created the pod, it took a while, and we see here the pod has been created. Now we go. Okay, now I'm going to exec into the parent container and show what the two containers looks like inside of this pod VM. So we go into a folder images, and now we see two containers. One should be for BusyBox, and the other one should be for Alpine. So here you see a containerd OCI compliant you see the root file system, and you see the config.json that tells runc how to execute the container. And this one, I don't know which one this one is. I think this is the BusyBox. Okay. Now I'll just fast forward a little bit more. So we look at the other one. I'm just going to fast forward. We will see that it's the Alpine container. And that concludes the demo. I wanted to show a demo that was simple enough that it conveys the essence of what we were working on. Now that I've shown the presentation, the diagrams, and the demo, are there any questions?
I have one. What's the current status of this? Is this available for people to try out and play with it?
It is. So notice that this page is master in the Virtual Kubelet project. And this is the Virtual Kubelet project. We're under providers, under Vic. This explains the design, and this explains how to build it and how to use it.
Can you put these links in the meeting notes?
Sure. Let me. I'm not a member yet, so let me become a member, and then I'll add this.
Sure. You can still suggest changes, and I will add them right away. So you can add yourself to the group afterwards.
Okay. At this point, anybody else have any other questions?
I just have a very quick little question. Is there a appliance VM, like we need one appliance VM per node, per host, basically?
Yeah, that's the big model. But the host, the host does not actually run the pod or any containers.
Yeah, I understand that.
It's just the host that it hosts the port layer and the personas, and the port layer manipulates vSphere itself. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Luke? Okay.
Okay. It's very great.
All right. We're 2 minutes over. Thank you guys for attending, and just want a very brief update on the next meeting, which is going to potentially happen on 5th of July. We're going to investigate if it's gonna be there or not, because it's the 4th of July. So maybe it's not the best time to have a meeting. So probably gonna move that around a little bit. I'll make sure that everybody knows if we're moving the time or not. If not, see you guys next time. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Right, thanks.